How's it going?
If she's not here yet, do you just want to pick somebody else?
Maybe I'll do it at the end.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. All right. Good morning, everybody. Um, welcome to Economic Development and Small Business. The committee will come to order. Madam Clerk, would you please take the roll?
Chair Hoskins,
Here.
Representatives Grant, Whitsitt, Neely.
Here.
Liberati.
Here.
Coffia.
Here.
Farhat.
Here.
Miller.
Here.
Tisdale.
Here.
Van Workum.
Here.
Martin.
Here.
Roth.
Here.
St. Germain.
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have a quorum.
All right. All right. So today, our business today is a presentation from the Michigan Economic Development Corporation. Thank you. We're just making sure you all are awake today. Today we have the Michigan Economic Development Corporation here to give us a presentation. There's been certainly a lot of things, a lot of activity happening with economic development here in the state, and MEDC is a big player in that. And so I'm definitely looking forward to hearing from Quentin Messer, who's the Chief Executive Officer for MEDC, as well as Greg Bird, who's the Managing Director of Legislative and External Affairs for MEDC. So gentlemen, if you would please come up, and we look forward to hearing your presentation. Floor is yours.
Well, good morning. First of all, I'm Quentin Messer, Jr., CEO of MEDC, and Greg Bird has been introduced. Before I begin, I think, first of all, our continued thoughts and prayers with all those affected by the tragedy in Michigan State, and then also those who continue to make sure that they get their power restored. So I want to state that first. At bottom, our responsibility at MEDC is to provide unvarnished, clear advice and counsel to both the legislative and executive branches as it relates to making sure that there's prosperity on both peninsulas. And so what's the point of all this? It's really building a championship economy. We're on a quest to be great because that's who we are as a state, as Michiganders. Next slide, please, Mary. So I'm a big sports person. Anybody who's had more than 2 minutes of a conversation with me knows that I love sports, although I was an awful athlete. And what I realized is that Michiganders are really focused on winning. And I think a lot of times winning is a sensibility. And so I wanted to, and I asked my colleagues, to put together this slide. And this really shows how we, whether it's our universities, our teams, I know people have frustrations with the Lions, but the Lions even won 3 championships, none since '58, but still they've won 3 championships. And so what we've said is Michiganders are relentlessly focused on winning. We have to have that same sensibility when it comes to economic development. Next slide, Greg. So what are some of the challenges that we have to address to realize Michigan's right to win? I think first, population trends. And what we see on this slide is that in every census since 1970, we've lost a congressional seat. So in 1970, we had 19. Today, we have 13. And that's a function of population. And we also understand the ramification that has for federal funding, although we have a congressional delegation and 2 senators who work across the aisles who really do, I think, still punch above the weight, but we have to be very concerned. I'm a native Floridian, and the thought that If you would have ever said to me, Georgia would have more people, or North Carolina, than Michigan, I would have said no. But that's our reality today. But I think that there is, because of your actions, when we work together, I think there's hope on that. We talked about federal funds. A lot of what we have been talking about and what you'll realize, hopefully, in the presentation, there's a lot more to MEDC besides what you always, or not always, but what you sometimes read in the paper. But federal funds, whether through the CHIPS Act or the Inflation Reduction Act, have fundamentally changed the equation. A lot of companies that have previously not looked at investing in the U.S. are now investing in the U.S. because of those federal dollars. And we must meet that moment because we have intense competition among the other 49 states who are looking to compete. So industry shifts. Anybody who has been paying attention to papers knows about the transition from the internal combustion engine to other propulsion systems, notably electric vehicles, but also hydrogen fuel cell and others. And even within EV, we see that there are competing battery chemistries, whether it be lithium ion phosphate or cobalt magnesium, which has significant extractive and ecological issues. I haven't taken a chemistry course since Reagan was president, but that's the extent of my chemistry. But I will tell you this, that we have to be aware of not only the industry shifts in EV mobility because of who we are in Michigan, but there are other sectors as well that have been similarly impacted by either regulatory change or consumer behavior change. I think semiconductors, another industry that's critically important to Michigan, clean energy, agribusiness, tourism, hospitality, life sciences, medical devices. I mean, we have, and the great blessing of Michigan is that we have a very rich and diverse economy, but they're all are subject to either consumer changes or regulatory changes or geopolitical changes. And we have to make sure that we, as best as possible, are prepared for all those. Climate change. I think one of the benefits, or I shouldn't say benefits, better stated, there will be certain regions that are going to benefit from the greater frequency of extreme weather. Michigan, the Great Lakes more broadly, are going to be one of those regions. We do not, I know whatever people may think about the weather here, I will take our weather any day after having evacuated from a hurricane when I lived in Louisiana. And those hurricanes on the Gulf Coast, whether it be tornadoes in the Great Plains, whether it be fires in the Pacific Northwest, there's water scarcity in the Colorado River basin, these are all things that will increasingly not only affect where people live, but where people can build homes and where people can get homeowners insurance. We're not going to have those challenges here in Michigan, and I think that we can begin to see not only businesses make location decisions, but individual men and women make those decisions. We have to be relevant. We realize that we have 83 tremendous counties on 2 peninsulas, and that there are uniquely different things that are required for success in the UP versus success in the Thumb, success up north, success in Grand Rapids region, success in Southeast Michigan, success here in the capital region, all across. So we at MEDC need to be tailored. We have a team called our Regional Prosperity Team that is an amalgam of our work in business attraction as well as community development in response to the fact that, as the title of this committee implies, communities, men and women, our friends and neighbors, have economic challenges. They don't just line up in a business attraction or a workforce or community development, but there are challenges to their economic prosperity and destiny upon which we have to focus. And then finally, perception. I think one of the biggest things that there's some misperceptions, some dated perceptions about Michigan, but we all know that perception is reality until you change your perception. So I think there's aggressive steps that we can take. We can talk about that further. We are going to launch it's a modest campaign, but $10 million for talent attraction to let this next generation know who Michigan is today, the opportunities that are in Michigan today. Next slide, please, Greg. So this slide is our placement slide, and the basic takeaway from this is, so here's what we're focused on. Here's our North Star, and I won't read everything. You have, I think, paper copies, but I really want to focus on the 6 focus areas: attract and retain and grow business. We've talked about that. That gets into our business development program grants as well as SOAR. Support and grow our talent. That gets into our work and talent solutions. We've really expanded that over the last 18 months or so. Develop attractive places. That is our community development program. It's also SHPO is a part of MEDC. It's also our Michigan Arts and Cultural Council, also part of MEDC. Accelerate high-tech innovation. We have an entrepreneurship and innovation team that's working with folks like Dub Song and others, really thinking about how do we accelerate high-tech and other high-growth entrepreneurialism. And I would just parenthetically note, there are 5 or 6 unicorns, companies that have been valued at $1 billion that are relatively new startup companies. That is critically important because I would argue that who Michigan is today is a function of who were unicorns 100 years ago, whether it was, Ford or GM or some of the other companies that became such successes, they created foundations. And that's the hope. I know that one of the members, one of our first meetings I ever had with Representative Van Berkel, made the great point that we're not looking necessarily just to create jobs, that we want to create more job creators. And that's where you get to on entrepreneurship. And then market to state. Travel Michigan is a part of it. Pure Michigan is a part of it. We also realize we have to market to state for professionals. In addition to telling people what you can do in Michigan, we need to be about the business of telling people who we are in Michigan today, not who we were, 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago. And finally, support small businesses. We've elevated this role. We have 2 senior vice presidents focused on small business services and solutions. We work very closely with our small business development centers. We continue to support PTAX. We have smart zones, and we're continuing to think about programming to make sure that small and medium-sized businesses are supporting. And just parenthetically, we know no business is small to the owner, and they're the anchor of a lot of communities, and we will look forward to engaging further in their growth. Next slide. So it's a Team Michigan approach. We realize that one of the things that we can do is make sure that we're working not only with our sister agencies, whether it be LEO, MDOT, or EGLE, but also working with local and regional economic development organizations, municipalities, working with this body and working with the executive branch. It really is a Team Michigan approach, because when a company, whether it's an incumbent Michigan business or someone that's looking at Michigan for the first time, they are not saying, okay, that's a MEDC issue or a LEO issue or whoever issue. They want solutions. And as we all know, many of you are small business men and women or are working for large corporations. People want to press the easy button. And we have to, and we're duty bound to make sure that we make it easier for people to press the easy button. Next slide. So what does MEDC do? We had the placemat slide, but I really want to kind of focus more, because I think a lot of times in the media it presents kind of a flat, one-dimensional aspect about our work in business attraction, retention, and expansion. But we support transformational projects through SOAR. We talked about that. But we also support placemaking investments. In fact, right now there's a Michigan Strategic Fund board meeting that's focused on placemaking, focused on a couple of projects up in the UP, projects also in the city of Detroit that are about making sure that we have the quality housing stock, that we have amenities, whether it be mixed-use development and others, that are going to be critically important for people to want to live, work, and play here in Michigan. We provide buyer and supporter matchmaking opportunities through Pure Michigan Business Connect, expansion into international markets, work very closely. We have a tremendous team that works closely with small and medium-sized businesses to access those markets. We accelerate startup opportunities through our entrepreneurship and innovation team, help small businesses grow. We talked about some of the work that we do there, providing funding for our small business development centers, support of our PTAC, ensuring that we have smart zones. And then we've already talked about Pure Michigan. And then we also, through SHPO, protect and rehabilitate Michigan's historic places. Next slide. So we have to win in our own backyard. Just jumping back to a sports analogy, if anybody has watched any college football, you know that the number one predictor of success in college football is winning your own recruiting base. You have to dominate and win the recruiting, in-state recruiting, before you can go national. If you look at somebody like Nick Saban at Alabama, I know folks here may have feelings about him. I would tell you, moving from Louisiana, people called him Nick Satan, so no one dislikes him more than folks who are LSU Tiger fans. But the thing about Nick Saban, what he did with Alabama, Freudian slip there, I guess, is that he was able to basically defeat Auburn in-state recruiting in Alabama, and then eventually take that national. He was able to go in Texas and get great recruits. He was able to go in Mississippi and get their top recruits. The same with Louisiana. And he ended up getting quarterbacks like Bryce Young and Tua from California and Hawaii. What's the analogous to economic development? We have to make sure that we grow our small and medium-sized businesses here, make sure that we continue to nurture their growth here, because they may get to a certain point in scale and say, hey, maybe Michigan hasn't shown us the love, and we'll go somewhere else. And so we have to make sure that we build a moat around Michigan businesses, because every business that is a multinational company, publicly traded, started as a small business. So you have to begin those relationships early and often. Next slide, Greg. So we want to talk about and frame some of our small business services. I've alluded to them, but we all know that small business is a clumsy general term for very specific types of businesses. And these are three specific phases. There's other phases, early stage and micro businesses. We are really looking to build that out, and we are doing some work with a Trusted Navigator program that you're going to be hearing more about, that's going to help businesses, whether it be those by BIPOC community, veterans, women, people who have historically not been entrepreneurs, trying to show them the way and mentor them to have business success. Growth stage, you see some of the programming there that we have. The second stage is Pure Michigan Business Connect. I alluded to that before. You see some of the international trade as well as the Industry 4.0. I just want to say parenthetically that even today, the MSF board is going to take up an opportunity to provide continued support for the Edward Lowe Foundation, which is a Michigan-based foundation that's been very focused on accelerating second stage business growth nationally, internationally, but particularly in its home state of Michigan. Next slide. So one of the things that we're proud of is that Michigan was one of the forerunners when it came to SBCI 1.0 nearly a decade ago. And today, now it's one of the first 5 states to receive its allocation for SSBCI 2.0. And we are in the process of working with Treasury to deploy these dollars. These dollars can be used in a number of different ways for greater technical assistance for small business, accelerating venture capital growth and development for some of our high-tech companies that was in sort of our early and growth stage, and working with micro businesses. So we look forward to providing further updates on SSBCI 2.0. Next slide. And this is some of the areas that you'll see. You can basically see the growth that is expected not only by U.S. Treasury, but also by the Whitmer-Gilchrist administration and others, to make sure that we are focused on today's small businessmen and women and trying to remove those impediments for their growth. Our hope is to make sure that we create a situation where the market can dictate whether or not a small business survives, rather than maybe being knocked off before they even get to a chance to see their true worth in the marketplace. Next slide. The Talent Action Team. I talked about one of the things that I was happy about our ability over the last 12 to 16 months, led by Carrie Impersal Singh, who's our Chief Talent Solutions and Engagement Officer. We realized that, when it beyond financing, besides sites, but talent. Companies of all sizes are seeking solutions to talent. And we realize that there are broader issues that we have to really look at to make sure that we improve our labor force participation rate. But one of the things that we realized, we needed to come alongside and create a concierge service. Again, pressing the easy button to make it easier for businesses of all sizes to access programming not only at MEDC, but at LEO and other governmental units. This goes back again to that Team Michigan approach. There cannot be a wrong door, and we are continually stressing to all of our teammates that, look, it's not satisfactory for us to say, well, that's not our issue. If a business person or anyone else comes, we have to make sure that our customer service paradigm is shifted such that we point people in the right direction, even if it's not our direct jurisdiction. And these are just some of the things that we're doing. I would just say, parenthetically, before we move to the next slide, is one of the two things that I'm very excited about is that we've created talent action teams in both the mobility and semiconductors sectors initially. And why is that important? One of the things I talked about, challenges that we have to deal with, are industry shifts. We have to make sure that it is easy for companies, particularly our Tier 1, Tier 2, and especially Tier 3 suppliers that have been really focused on internal combustion engine, making sure that they're prepared for EVs and other propulsion mechanisms. And part of that is making sure that they have support and access to services that can help train and retrain and upskill their workforce. Next slide, please. So as we draw to a close, I want to just frame out what is at stake in this transition. We are the state that put the world on wheels. We're more than mobility. We understand that. But we still understand that 1 out of 5 Michiganders employed somehow connected to this sector. So we have to make sure that we maintain what we have built. And I will tell you, if anyone has any doubt as to the viability of supporting the mobility sector, I was just in the state to the south on Friday at a panel. And I was on a panel with someone from Tennessee who was very happy to say that they have had some success, and they had 4 OEMs with operating facilities in Tennessee. The senior senator from South Carolina, Lindsey Graham, recently gloated, saying that they want to make South Carolina Detroit at the Battery Belt. Why do I tell you all that? People seek what we have, and we can't take it for granted. The fact that we have long value chains, supply chains that create opportunities, small and medium-sized businesses, large businesses, that's the reason why there are 17 Fortune 500 companies headquartered in Michigan. That's the reason why we have countless other publicly traded. That's why we have communities of all sizes that's been able to provide stable, life-affirming lives for generations, because we've had not only mobility, but we've had agribusiness and forestry, but we've had businesses that had long value chains. And so this tells you, and we can talk about this later, but the short of a long is we are in a situation where we have to win now. Because of the Inflation Reduction Act, more and more battery production, OEM assembly will be coming back to the U.S. It won't be like this forever. There will be a time, probably in the next, within the next 30 months, where a lot of the dollars at the federal level from the Inflation Reduction Act will be burned through the system, have worked their way through the system. The OEMs, the battery makers, will have made their alliance, and then you will see probably a resetting through the remainder of the decade, and then people may go back once we see where things shake out and consumer adaptation, infrastructure build out. And it's not only just the battery and the OEM, but it's the infrastructure, charging stations, refuel, making sure that we have that type of infrastructure to support the consumer adaptation. Next slide, please. We also continuing this just shows some of the industry impacts. These are things that we all know. There is a significant cost of inaction whenever we do not at least compete and maintain a certain level of success when it comes to securing these battery manufacturing and OEM facilities. You see that population multiplier, 3.5 for every one job. There's 3.5 jobs, people that are added. The converse is true. When these jobs move away from Michigan, we see the decline of population that leads to the loss of congressional seats and the loss of Michigan's preeminence in Washington. Next slide. So I want to close on a couple of things. Just want to make sure, I think you're all aware of the distinction between MEDC and the Michigan Strategic Fund. So going back to 2006, MEDC and the Michigan Strategic Fund entered into a administrative agreement. MEDC makes the recommendations to the Michigan Strategic Fund. The Michigan Strategic Fund has 11 members, 9 appointed by the governor, 1 appointed by the Speaker of the House, and 1 appointed by the Senate Majority Leader. The MEDC cannot send a check, send an incentive, or do anything without without the approval of the MSF. So I think that's crucial to note that there is a public regulatory body that's actually meeting right now, agenda posted, information posted, that decides whether or not, whether it's a community development program grant, a business development program grant, SOAR, or any other thing that we might recommend in service of our strategy has to go through the Michigan Strategic Fund. Next slide. This is an approval process. We can dive into this later, but I wanted this to be shown because there may be new members, just to make sure that you understand how we work at MEDC and work in partnership with the MSF. I want to be sensitive to the chair's time and this committee's time. It may be better if we have a dialogue and rather than me just pounding you with PowerPoint slides. But we can talk about any specific slide that you want. But I think that's critically important that you understand that approval process. Next slide. I thank you for answering the call to public service. I thank your staff for working hard. And I'm appreciative of this opportunity. And I thank my colleague and all my colleagues at MEDC and all economic developers on both peninsulas for the opportunity to share a bit with you this morning.
All right, and thank you so much for that presentation. Before we get into questions, I see many of the committee members have them. I just want to start with a couple of my own. Just starting with, a basic one. What are some of MEDC's legislative priorities that they're hoping to work with us on?
Sure. I can begin, and then Greg, if you want to follow up. I think the first thing what is critically important is knowing our role. I think that is that we have recommendations based on economic development, but we understand that developing priorities is a complex mix that it has to make sure that it's in partnership with the executive and legislative branches. But let me just talk about a number of them from an economic development lens and not get into the other pieces, and Greg will kick me under the table or correct anything I get wrong. I want to just set a context. Right now, Michigan has exactly 2 business attraction tools. We have a business development grant that is up to $10 million, that's capped at $10 million, and we have SOAR. So we have, in essence, a small hammer and a big hammer. So for us, everything has to look like a nail because we don't have anything else. And I think one of the things that I think will be critically important is make sure that we have more tailored tools, an R&D tax credit. We talked about the need for innovation. Michigan is a state of innovation. I think that's critically important. Something like a Good Jobs for Michigan or some equivalent to make sure that we can have those opportunities that can be tailored so that everything isn't SOAR and we are not missing out on some of those opportunities that are bigger than the business development program grant. I think from a community development piece, we want to make sure that there's work done for the transformational brownfield program. I think that that's worked out very well, but I think there's opportunities for growth. We continue to see it oversubscribed. We're up against the cap, which speaks to the tremendous need for us to have continued flexibility to be responsive to the market. I think there's some thoughts we could have about making sure that the rent zone legislation is more flexible. I think the optimal word is flexibility, because we are now in unprecedented time. Who would have thought that there would have been a CHIPS Act or an Inflation Reduction Act? We need to make sure that we have state policies that are responsible for this. I think a couple other things that a note before I turn it over to Greg. I think there's always support for talent. We talked about talent. The number one asset in Michigan are the men and women, but also our next generation. We need to make sure that we have programming dollars for internships. Companies tell us all the time, if we had opportunities for internships, or we could fund internships for young people, we could maybe connect them to opportunities and jobs that maybe they wouldn't have previously considered. I also think a couple other areas is to make sure that we have a SOAR that is reflective of the totality of those things that we know are important to companies. We see increasingly child care and elder care is increasingly important. There's no reason why you couldn't have an aspect of SOAR that deals with that, or what I call the care infrastructure, whether it's making sure that we help people with mobility. So that's just a high-level gloss. Greg, if you want to talk about further, and we can make sure that we can provide you particular documentation about some of these things that I just outlined. Greg?
No, I think you covered everything from a high level, so.
And thank you for that. And this is certainly a conversation that I've been having about what it looks like to incentivize business here in the state, how we can reimagine what that looks like, and including those things that you just mentioned of some using a SOAR type fund to really help impact those things that many of our communities might need, whether it be child care or housing or whatever the need might be. So I definitely would like to have you follow up with some of those suggestions as well. I have one more thing, and then I'll pass it on to my colleagues. Just you mentioned the navigators for our minority and veteran and women-led businesses. I just want to hear a little bit more about that. We have something similar in Oakland County that I think has been working. Oakland Forward has been working pretty well. So I'm just curious what that looks like at the state level.
Yeah, so our small business team, led by Amy Rencher and Natalie Chumika, have been really developing what they call a Trusted Navigators Network. Because we realize is that we have small business development centers. We also have PTACs. We have smart zones. We have a lot of things within our small and entrepreneurial ecosystem, but there's still, I don't know whether it's a psychological barrier or actual real barriers, that there are companies and entrepreneurs and dreamers and risk takers who still don't feel as if those programming really relates to them or they can really engage with them. So that's why we're looking to engage with trusted navigators, people who have credibility, can meet people where they are, can speak their language, and also validate their entrepreneurial aspiration. There's nothing wrong with someone saying, hey, look, I want to start a barbershop as a small business. Now, I may not be able to get funding from the Michigan Strategic Fund, but there's nothing wrong with that, because that barbershop could be franchised and you could become Hair Clips, or you could become Paul Mitchell Studios. And so we have to make sure that we are engaging with folks where they are, and that's the Trusted Navigators. Greg or I can get you further information about how we're thinking about that. I would say another piece of it is, how do you engage to secure financial funding? Some people are not yet ready to be banked through traditional institutions, but directing them to community development community development financial institutions, or CDFIs, could be another way that we could facilitate, and working with those institutions to create financial instruments that have characteristics of both debt and equity, because there are some people who just can't or don't want to have any more debt, but maybe they may be reluctant to give up equity in their business. So we need to have something that has characteristics of both, and these are things that we can do and are in the process of doing. Greg, did you want to add anything? We can make sure that we provide, or even make sure in future that we can have Amy and others testify about that particular program if it be the chair's prerogative.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I have a lot more questions too, particularly about small businesses, but I'm going to share and let my colleagues ask some questions as well, starting with Representative Roth.
Sorry, I didn't. Thank you, Chair. Quentin Messer, great to have you here, as always. I've had great interactions with you. I appreciate it. Local communities are talking about EDOs on their own. Is there help? Is there information? How do we get local, small communities involved with that?
So that's a great question. We have an interlocal agreement where we engage with a lot of our smaller communities. We have development-ready community programs to make sure that communities of development, but we're also trying to be much more flexible in our engagement with communities. Typically, not typically, in actuality, what happens is we at MEDC have divided the state up into 10 regions, and we have a regional prosperity team. Each of those 10 teams has a managing director who is really working to engage with our local, county, regional economic development partners to make sure that we are understanding their desires as it relates to not only community development, but also business attraction, retention, and expansion. There's always room for improvement, but I'm very excited about the work that we have done since we went to this structure in August of last year, and I think that we're on the precipice of doing some bigger things.
Thank you.
Anytime, thank you.
All right. Vice Chair Tisdale.
Thank you, Chair. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. Mr. Byrd, it's good to know that you're not just a slide management expert, but that you also kick him under the table. This page on the EV production numbers and the direction we're heading, down at the bottom in the far right column, it says 12% of NAMR. What is NAMR?
The North America, I think it's North America. It's basically a market share.
Like North American manufacturing revenue, maybe,
yes,
or something.
yes,
Okay,
yes.
So we're looking at Michigan wants to get 12% of that.
Well, I think what it is what's your realistic market capture at this stage?
Okay.
And so at this stage, where we are currently in the ICE world, we are between 8 and 12% of current vehicle sales and revenue from vehicle manufacturing. We know because of what's happened along the I-75 automotive corridor and other decisions that have been made, and just the share of who's making cars and who's buying those cars, that our ability to maintain that is going to be a function as much of our ability to see the success of our legacy Big Three, as well as maybe attract others into Michigan. But it's a function of our ability to maintain that share, because that share is directly tied to the level of employment. And so what you see there is, if we maintain that around 8%, you see the number of jobs. If we miss, and when I say miss, there are a number of projects that are currently being decided. You know, we've all probably more than we want to have talked about Blue Oval, Battery Park, Michigan. We know that Stellantis has other projects, as does GM, as does foreign manufacturers. And so there's a certain share of capture that we have to win. We won't win all of them because there are certain constraints.
Oh, I
Available
just
sites. Yep.
found it fascinating
Yep.
that one of the advantages from a manufacturing standpoint of EVs is like an EV drivetrain has 12 moving parts,
Right.
whereas a ICE drivetrain obviously has thousands of moving parts.
Right.
So we could quadruple our share of EV vehicles, add 430,000 jobs in EV, and keep our hybrid and ICE jobs the same?
Well, I think that's making the assumption that we're going to do that. There's not going to be an immediate cutoff of ICE jobs. I mean, because
Sure. I hope not.
I'm sorry.
I hope not.
Right, and candidly, for a lot of companies, the ICE vehicle sales are funding their research and development in EV.
Absolutely.
And so we were basically saying there is a baseline. There's probably not going to be a lot of robust competition necessarily for those ICE jobs. Or the hybrid is really the competition is going to be for those EV jobs. So that just shows you different scenarios of our ability in Michigan to capture, 3%, 8%, or 12%. And that's the focus is really on that. I'm going to say it's not quite Columbia blue, but or Honolulu blue, but the top blue bar there.
Right. Yeah, that represents a 33% growth
Yeah.
in total jobs. So that would be that's something with so many fewer moving parts. That's just what captured my attention. But thank you.
Yep, no doubt.
All right, thank you, Representative. Representative Farhat.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to use a sports analogy for the first half of my question, right?
Okay.
The San Antonio Spurs, they had Tim Duncan and the team, great. They've struggled to attract players back to San Antonio. The Riverwalk there, the boardwalk there, as they call it, is a great feature, but nobody wants to go there for the boardwalk. There's not enough to attract real players, right? Similar to be said of Michigan. What are we doing to invest in the actual meaningful infrastructure to say, you know what, we want talent to come here. Talent is coming here, right? More than just that, too, what investments are we making when we bundle these larger economic development deals that say, well, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, the bones of this deal are leaving behind good, fertile grounds for more development to be spun off as a result. That's kind of the kind of principle of my first half of my question. So I'll let you.
Yeah, sure. So I'll answer the
And for the record, by the way, I'm a big Greg Popovich fan, big San Antonio Spurs fan. So not to say the boardwalk isn't good, but
Yeah, I understand that. So let me take the second half, and then I'll try to address because I think inside your question about the Spurs is an important unlock about some things that we're doing differently here in Michigan. So one of the things I've talked about, and Greg, if you can go to that slide that talks about the things that we do, I think it's, yeah. So one of the things that's vitally important, we understand that companies, people aren't going to go to places that don't have amenities, and so we're trying to really accelerate mixed-use facilities or mixed-use developments all across the state. We have a significant Main Street program. We've had a facade development program for some of our smaller downtowns, and we also have become very flexible. I mean, there are some cities that have not had a historic downtown, that have not been able to take advantage of resources, so we're now working with them to creatively and be more flexible about some of the tools that we use. One of the reasons why I wanted to show this slide is we realize placemaking is vitally important. You got to have that infrastructure such that people will want to live in, I'm not going to name particular places, but live all across the state on both peninsulas. I would just say about Popovich, I mean, Pop is one of the greatest coaches, but I think one of the challenges that Pop has faced is he hasn't really changed with the times. So he's coaching his team, the same way when he had David Robinson, Jared, Manu Ginobili. Those guys could be coached hard. These young folks, it's just different. And I think one of the things that the lesson for us is we need to make sure that without losing our character, staying true to who we are as Michiganders, that we adjust and make sure that we are having a campaign that attracts the young people, tens of thousands, who go to Michigan State, University of Michigan, Tech, Eastern, Wayne State, you name it, Oakland University. That's the seedbed. The 2 and 4 year folks who go to Lansing Community College and Henry Ford Community Colleges and others. I think there's an opportunity for us to become the best state for veterans and really work, and we are on the precipice of beginning some work with Major General Rogers and Director Oley and really actualizing that goal, which is a goal that Governor Whitmer has. So we have to continue to recruit, but also have messaging that's relevant for today's Michigander. And I think the challenge that Pop and the Spurs have faced is they were very successful in the 90s and 2000s, but it's the 20s now. And I think some of their changes, whether it's moving with and having a team that can play fast, that can, that takes, open three-pointers on the break, which is something Popovich never would have done. You have to adjust to the game. The game has changed, and so the analogy here is we have to make sure that we are prepared for today's mobility sector. That's why it's important to continue to support the Office of Future Mobility and Electrification, to make sure that we are competitive, because it's a combination. You can have the greatest space that you want to have, but if you don't have jobs and you don't have businesses that will be large-scale customers, people aren't going to come. I came from a place, there are very few places that are as wonderful as New Orleans, but it has struggled for long-term growth because they don't have those job economic driver industries in the same way that we have here in Michigan. We have to do both, and I think there is work that we can do with the help of this committee and the input of this committee, by the way.
And just as a follow-up, right, as we look at the diversification of industries that we're attracting to Michigan, right, aside from manufacturing, and a big component of that is retaining college graduates, right? And so as as something to touch on that I'd like to hear is, what is it MEDC is doing as well to keep graduates, right? So from the U of M, for example, we lose a great number of undergraduate or graduate level individuals who leave and go on to out-of-state jobs, or they leave. How do we keep Michigan talent in Michigan from these universities, I suppose? Is there something in the legislation you're looking us to work on? Is there something MEDC is working on? Just to touch base on that point, because that was important.
Greg, can you get to the talent slide? Because I think it's directly to the representatives. Question, yes. There you go. So one of the things that, to your excellent point, working with our partners at Leo, we realize that one of the things that we have to do is be very aggressive about telling that Michigan story of who we are today. So that's why I talked about the recent $10 million talent marketing campaign that was approved by the Michigan Strategic Fund. That is one first step that will be critically important. I talked about the talent action teams in mobility in the semiconductor sector. A big part of that component is working with our 2 and 4 year institutions. Oftentimes, there are a lot of people, a lot of young men and women who graduate and say, hey, I moved to Chicago, or I moved to Boston, or I moved to Seattle, or moved wherever, because I didn't think that there was a job like this here in Michigan. And I think we need to come alongside our career development offices at our higher ed institutions to help them educate that, as well as our high school students. Not everybody goes to college directly straight away, and so we have to come alongside and tell them, hey, look, working in advanced manufacturing isn't what you saw in the 30s and 40s. Clean jobs, and not even advanced manufacturing. I was up in the UP, I don't know when it was, a couple of weeks ago, and I was out in the forest with a young man, 23 years old, operating $1 million plus material, making $70,000 a year. Had a great truck. He was very happy. It was almost like he was in the cockpit of a plane. Making sure that young people are aware that Michigan is uniquely positioned to provide those opportunities. So those are some of the work that we could do. Now, always is an issue of resource allocation. $10 million is, yes, it's a lot of money, but it's not a lot of money when you're trying to tell a diverse story across so many different industries. So those are some of the things that we have to think about. And, you know, I think continued support for our 2 and 4 years, but also making sure that we work with our skilled trades, men and women, to elevate and educate people on the dignity and somewhat lucrative nature of that work, particularly for young people.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chair.
Right, thank you. All right, next we'll have Representative Van Workum, and if he can work in a sports analogy, he gets bonus points.
Well, everyone actually knows that the secret to Popovich was his wine club. So there may be a connection to Michigan with what he did with his players and their love for wine and how that kept them all together. But as you know, I'd much rather be talking about entrepreneurship. It's where I like to focus my time when we're talking about economic development. But what could properly be before the House today is related to the SOAR Fund. And one of the issues that coming up previous years, and not to when you were here, and certainly not when many of us were here, was the issue of mega tax credits. At one point, we actually thought these could bankrupt the state of how much is owed in these mega tax credits. I'm curious to know how much Ford is scheduled to receive in these tax credits, when they are expected, because I have seen a number in possibly as early as 2025. And when you're negotiating these types of deals, is there any consideration in what the state already owes or has a liability on these tax credits?
It's a great question, and I would, I don't think that I have the mega information in front of me, but we can get that information to you, and I don't want to speculate on when the duration of those credits. But I would say the following. Yes, it is considered, but I will tell you honestly, we've spent a lot of time looking at and learning from what happened in September of 2021, which was the decision by Ford to go to Tennessee and Kentucky. And it was illustrative not only just for Ford, but also large-scale, highly advanced manufacturing. And I think there are a number of things that are critically important when companies are making, and I would say that this is not just, you know, multinational companies like Ford, but you could also bring it down to any company that's looking to expand. I would say that there are 5 things. And this is in no order, because I think it varies across, for companies. People, are you going to be able to find talent? Are you going to be able to recruit them? Are they going to have a place to live? Are they going to have easy ways of transport to get to and from your local location? Place. Will there be a place, meaning are you going to have a sufficient site? You know, in the case of Ford and a lot of other companies that are similarly advanced manufacturing require hundreds, if not thousands of acres for their footprint. Then you have to, the people are looking at utility rates. We are dealing with highly energy intensive industries, regulatory environment, and then also, candidly, we get down to financial incentives. I don't have this for certain, but based upon what I've industry scuttlebutt, when I say industry scuttlebutt, economic developers talk, you know, we also talk to site selectors. Michigan did not offer Ford the most money for this particular opportunity. And I think part of what, when you look at the price tag, we should break it out. You know, 210, I'm not saying that's not an insignificant number, 210 million going to Ford, but what's being voted on is money for the site. We are and have been, as a state, I would argue, at least 10, probably closer to 20 years behind some of our competitive states. Other states have had sites that have been ready with the infrastructure and everything required so that when you don't always know when a company is looking at you. So when companies are looking, these states are ready. And what we are also seeing in the transition, especially in the mobility sector, is speed to market. Our companies' ability to basically agree, yes, we'll be there, and within 3 to 4 months to be breaking ground on their facility is vitally important. So that's why some of the price tag is there, because we're trying to do in a compressed period of time what other states have done over the last 10, 20 years. Imagine if you were rehabbing your home and your neighbor has been doing it a little bit for the last 5 or 10 years, and you decide to do exactly the same thing he or she did. Right now, you might be spending more money in the short run to catch up to where they're going to be competitive. And so I think that's partially where we are. But I think to your point, Mr. Representative, just on the entrepreneurship and innovation, we believe, in part, securing these opportunities will help spur entrepreneurialism and innovation, because there is going to be a need for companies to be supplied, whether it's industrial cleaning, whether it's going to be supplying some of the pieces of making sure of making sure that the battery, the cell, is affixed to the machine, to make affixed to the underbody of the vehicle, making sure that we still keep these vehicle programs in Michigan allows Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 suppliers to continue to thrive. And for some, they're going to use whatever money they receive from Ford to diversify into other industries, as we've seen companies throughout the Lower Peninsula move some Tier 1, Tier 2s into aerospace and others. So that's...
Thank you. Yeah, I get the broader aspect here, and I much would rather that the technology that is being discussed for these EVs was a technology we developed here in Michigan rather than having to go overseas to license that agreement. I fully agree on the entrepreneurship side and what you're saying, but as legislatures, we have a specific issue here of what is currently hundreds of millions of dollars on the books, or potentially on the books, that we're going to have to come up for these tax credits. So again, because of how the agenda is, that any item could be properly brought to the House, we would really appreciate if we could get that information very soon on what is owed, and maybe a little bit more detail on how that is considered when these agreements are put in place, of already the dollars that are owed to these companies. And then if we have time, Chair, I have a separate question.
I'm going to go to Vice Chair Grant, and then if we have time, I'll come back to you.
Thank you, Chair. So my question is on the kind of how we're looking at the partners that we have at the table across our state. And I'm looking at your team approach slide. And the first thing that stuck out to me is we have higher education at the table, and that K through 12 piece as a partner stuck out to me. And you spoke on this a little bit, but I'm wondering, in what ways can we bring our K through 12 educational system in a little bit more to be a part of this kind of plan that we're talking about? So when we talk about like pipelines for talent, workforce development, and also attraction and retention, because many employees and employers that I speak to, they're looking at our educational systems, right? Like, if we're being honest, we have a lot of work to do as we rank, where we rank in education. But so I see that K through 12 piece as a potential economic development tool in a few different ways. But as we talk about the evolution, like keeping up with the times as a state, we have to do the same thing with education. How can, I'm sorry, what the point that I'm also trying to make is as we kind of debate investments in education, to me, I just see the flat out reason why we should be doing that. But the case could be made a little bit more if we were tying these things together, like tying them to the piece of the pipeline, the very first step of that for economic development. Do you have any thoughts on how we could do a better job at that and seeing other states that are investing more in education at a very early level to tie into their economic development approach?
Yeah, sure, Madam Representative. I think a couple of things. Parenthetically, I mean, I think if you look at the governor's budget recommendations, you saw, investments in pre-K 3 education. I think the last budget she passed and was signed into law had record investments in K through 12 education. So I think there's a commitment to making sure. That's not to say that there isn't more work that needs to be done, but I think you see a commitment to having lifelong learning. Ironically, I and Superintendent Rice are in more frequent conversation about ways in which MEDC and K-12 education can work together. I will tell you this: based as you can see with the questions of the committee, I have more than enough to keep me busy in my economic development lane, so I don't want to swerve into other people's lane. But I will tell you this: successful economic development can help K-12 or pre-K 3 through 12 education in one significant way. And there are many ways, but particularly one significant way. We can make sure that we grow the tax base such that the overall tax burden on the individual Michigander is reduced, because there will be more people paying in, whether it's companies or the people they seek to employ. And so I think that that's one way that I could be of the best benefit to K-12 education. I also think making sure that we invite them and have them at the table. And I think we're much more intentional about that, because we do have a talent solutions team that has a member of that team, Spencer Lucker, that is really constantly thinking about how to work with the ISDs, how to make sure that as they think about what is much more relevant for industry and the marketplace, that we're bringing that intelligence back in real time. But if there are other suggestions that you have, or this committee or anybody else, we'll happily do it. But what I don't want to do is swerve in someone else's lane when I haven't dominated and owned my own yet. And so I think the key is to make sure that we have robust economic growth on both peninsulas, such that the amount of resources that are available for use by government is growing, but not growing on a smaller and decreasing number of Michiganders.
You're all set?
Yes, thank you.
All right. Representative Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I hear all this, MEDC, of course, is trying to pitch the growth and the attraction for Michigan. One of the questions I have is what we can do with what we have here already. I live in Genesee County, worked in Pontiac, travel up north on 75. I see a lot of concrete pads out there, buildings taken down, equipment moved out to save on property tax. We have a lot of infrastructure, great infrastructure in Genesee County, raw water, broadband, wastewater treatment. But everybody, all the corporate boards are afraid of the liability of brownfields. A lot of those concrete pads are in trust. You mentioned brownfields real quickly. Is this going to become a government function to be able to get rid of the brownfields and encourage people to come in? Because we're building a brand new plant and adding new roads and ramps in cornfields and bean fields, and we have brownfields already ready to go with the infrastructure in place if we just get the remediation. Your partners have plans for that?
Yeah, sure. So I think that we are always looking to market all our sites. What we've discovered is for a variety of different reasons. Companies, particularly those in the particularly in the mobility, semiconductor sectors, have been a little bit reticent to move or move to brownfield locations. That doesn't mean that we don't continue to market it. I mean, most recently, Buick City is something that we've marketed, and there was a sale from the Racier Trust to Ashley Capital. We hope to do other things like that. With regard to assumption of liability and where or if the state of Michigan should be involved, I'm going to defer that to our elected officials. But I will tell you this, is that we market the entirety of our assets. When I say our assets, who we are as men and women, our great quality of place, our locational advantage, the fact that we have 4 wonderful seasons, and we've got some brownfields. And there are some investors who will willingly invest in brownfields, and we aggressively court those particular companies. Now, it did not work in this particular case, but there may be opportunities in the future. But you're absolutely right. We are always focused on building on who and what we have and marketing that as aggressively and as smartly as we possibly can.
All right, thank you. And I got to make that one the last question here. Gentlemen, thank you. Yes, sorry, Representative Van Workum. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your presentation. If you could follow up with some of those things that me and that some of the members asked for, that would be greatly appreciated. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Stay safe. Thank you.
With that, let's see. Representative Grant moves to approve the minutes of the January 31st meeting. Without objection, so ordered. And Representative Grant also moves to excuse absent members. Without objection, so ordered. There being no further business before the committee will stand adjourned.